My friends, our God is with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. One day, Jesus was standing by Lake Gennesaret, and the crowd pressed in on him to hear the word of God. He saw two boats moored by the side of the lake. The fishers had disembarked and were washing their nets. Jesus stepped into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to pull out a short distance from the shore. Then, remaining seated, he continued to teach the crowds from the boat. When he finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Pull out into the deep water and lower your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Rabbi, we have been working hard all night and have caught nothing. But if you say so, I will lower the nets." Upon doing so, they caught such a great number of fish that their nets were breaking. They signaled to their mates in the other boats to come and help them, and together they filled two boats until they both nearly sank. After Simon saw what happened, he was filled with awe and fell down before Jesus, saying, "Leave me, Rabbi, for I am a sinner." For Simon and his shipmates were astonished at the size of the catch they had made, and as were James and John, Zebedee's sons, who were Simon's partners. Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will fish among humankind." And when they brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. The good news of salvation. I always feel like, even though I only preach once a month, sometimes I feel like I always get the ones that have to do about like sin and things I don't really feel like talking about. Um, and I struggled with, as I read these readings, and my inner teenager this week was just feeling squeamish about it, remembering my Saturday afternoons as a teenager going to church to confession, and my word I'm kind of left with is like, ugh. And I think as a community, I don't hear it a lot in our language. There's not a lot in our preaching or our conversations in general about sin. And, we certainly acknowledge it in certain points, like in our penitential prayer and other pieces of our liturgy. But it's not, I don't think it's a significant focus very often. And I think really for good reason. I think at minimum, lots of us have the same kind of teenage experience that I do. Some mix of shame and fear and guilt, and maybe a bit of annoyance that you're spending your Saturday afternoon wasting your time in church. I just felt like my mom then just like, she just shuddered when I said that. But and I also know, all joking aside, I think for myself and for I'm sure many of us too, some focus on Christianity's sometimes over focus on sin. And I think the incorrect labeling of some things as sin has caused a lot of pain for us too. And there's just a lot of ways that the ideas of, I think, sin and what that means in our lives has been really distorted and has caused a lot of pain. And I think even for those that are here that maybe didn't grow up within a religious context, we have plenty of societal messages that also let us know quite clearly that we're wrong, we're bad, we're not good enough, we don't fit in, there's something not right about us, or we deserve the bad things that have happened to us. So again, I think it's for really good reason why this doesn't need to be a huge focus often. But as I looked at these readings today, and I read some different reflections and also looked back on things that I've written in the past too, and I tried to like kind of weave around these words, but both Isaiah, Paul, and Peter all have this language that seems quite intense and self-loathing. Isaiah talks about being doomed with unclean lips. Paul refers to himself as being abnormally born and the least of the apostles. And Peter falls down in front of Jesus and declares that he's a sinner. And so again, I'm left asking, what do we do with these stories, with these men's self-loathing, what it looks like self-loathing to me? Are we supposed to emulate that? And for what purpose? Why do we need to do that? I really feel like more often than not, I'm quite aware of my own shortcomings, and I feel like I don't need another reason to fall down and bemoan myself. But I think what's important in these readings is not so much the confession, or the confession is important, but what's really important, I think, is what happens before the confession and what happens after the confession. Because each of these people, Isaiah, Paul, and Peter, all had these amazing experiences of God's presence. Isaiah had this vision of God. And not only did he see God, but he also saw these angels, and these angels tending to him. And he saw God's glory throughout all of earth. And then Paul, the story today isn't about Paul getting knocked off his horse, but that's what he's alluding to, the fact that he was knocked off his horse and left blinded for days by God's presence. And then Peter is with God incarnate, with Jesus Christ, that Jesus stands beside him, and his presence there allows him to pull in an abundance of fish that Peter could have never brought in on his own. And so I think it's important for us to see that before there was ever a statement about unclean lips or being the least or being a sinner, that before any of that came out of these men's lips, first God's glory and power was present. And it was God that captured them, that knocked them down and overwhelmed them. And it was in that miraculous moment of God's presence that each of these individuals felt compelled to speak out and to bear witness to their own weakness, limitations, and shortcomings. And there's something so incredible in that action. Because what was it that caused these men to confess? It doesn't really seem in that light. It wasn't their shame, and it wasn't someone telling them that they needed to do it to get to heaven. They felt compelled because they were in the presence of God, because they saw his presence, his power, and I believe his loving and abundant grace. We are so often told that the best way to survive in this world is to hide the pieces of us that feel unclean, less, or that we might define as sinful. We are told that they need to remain unnamed and buried somewhere in us. We rarely let another person see them, and we're even afraid to let God see them often, because we're afraid that they're going to turn their backs on us. But each of these stories today tell us something so different. These individuals, so awestruck by the power of God, then had the courage and strength and self-awareness to let themselves be fully seen. And it's so important to know that in not one of these stories did God ask for their confession. They were moved to confess. God didn't need their confession, and I don't think God needs our confession. But maybe because these men confessed, they were able to let go. And maybe that's what we need to do too. It's not about getting to heaven or even getting forgiven, but it's being able to let go of the shame and pain that we feel and to be released of it and to know that God can take it and we don't have to hold it. We can hold so tightly, more tightly than I think anything else. We hold on to our inadequacies. We hold on to the things that we think others don't want to see in us. But I think the real tragedy in that is the reality that the things in us that feel most painful, most sinful, most inadequate, often come from the most beautiful part of us. They come from our desire to be loved, to be seen, and to be healed. And in this human world, those things sometimes come out sideways and get kind of messed up. And we get wounded by others, and we wound others, and we wound ourselves. But what our gospel tells us, our readings tell us today, and our whole Christian history tells us is that when our inadequacies are exposed, there is an option for our hurt to shift away from hate and move toward healing and light and an increase of love. In God's presence, we don't need to hold tight to these things anymore. In God's presence, there is no shame, because even those parts of us that feel inadequate or dark, they're loved and they're called sacred. And when we're open, healing is possible. But it goes one step further than that. Not only do I think God doesn't require our confession, but God's love compels us to confess that after that, then we get called, we get anointed, we get commissioned by God. It's in recognizing, when we can recognize our sin, our pain, our hurt, our inadequacy, that's when God looks at us and says, oh, I've got a plan for you. I've got a story for you. I've got something for you to do. And I was just waiting to be able to tell you. I was just waiting to anoint you and send you on this mission. Because Isaiah, Paul, and Peter each experienced God's presence, expose their weakness, and then they are called. God asks Isaiah, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? The risen Christ comes to Paul and tells him, go to all the people, go to all the nations and proclaim my love. And lastly, Jesus tells Peter that he no longer needs to fish in the sea, but instead he's going to fish in this world and he's going to bring people to God. And each and every one of them says yes. Isaiah says, here I am, send me. Paul works tirelessly till his death to share the good news. And Simon becomes Peter, the first leader of the ancient Catholic Church. So many of us were taught that we need to confess to get rid of our sin, to get forgiven, and hopefully make it to heaven. But Isaiah, Paul, and Peter show us something different. It's not about earning forgiveness or getting somewhere else. It's about being open, being free, and letting God's presence in. And it's in that action then that we become anointed to step into this world, to know confidently that we are God's chosen people, that we are called to go forth. It's not about getting rid of the shameful pieces in us, but it's about allowing God to be present to those pieces in us, to let those pieces keep getting transformed back to what they originally were, love and light and beauty and a desire to be good and to do good in this world. God's grace abounds. God's call is here for each and every one of us, no matter our mistakes or our triumphs. Each and every morning, God is simply asking to us, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And so with courage and love, let us continue to say with the whole of who we are, here I am, send me.